Personal Deposition of Selveth Orinkaz. Senior Calibration Examiner, 2nd Meridian Cohort. Varek Academic Combine, Orbital Station Vethkaz-7. Filed under Academic Conduct Protocol 44C, Case Reference 2291 ORRENK. I am aware that this deposition may be entered into the public record of the Combine. I am aware that several colleagues have advised me against filing it, and that one of them suggested, gently, that filing it was a form of professional self-destruction. I am filing it anyway, because the record currently reads as a series of procedural irregularities, and the record is wrong. What happened in Calibration Suite 7 during the 6-week window of my supervision was not a series of procedural irregularities. It was one thing, arrived at in a single working session by one person. I have spent 4 months deciding how to describe that one thing, and I have settled on the following. The Combine was wrong, has been wrong for a very long time, and a 26-year-old human from a Class 20 Deathworld demonstrated the nature of that wrongness in a single, uninterrupted working session. I intend to explain how. My name is Selveth Orinkaz. I am, or was until the events described here, a senior calibration examiner with the 2nd Meridian Cohort of the Varek Academic Combine. The Combine, for those reading this outside the guild structure, is the licensing body that certifies dimensional surveyors, spatial calibrators, and structural integrity analysts for work throughout the Varek-aligned sectors. If you want to assess a habitat ring, certify a load-bearing arch in a pressurized colony, or sign off on the dimensional tolerances of any installation above Class 6 complexity, you need a Combine seal. If you want a Combine seal, you pass the certification examination. If you want to pass the certification examination, you first pass the pre-entry assessment, which is administered by whomever the examiner primus assigns. For the last 83 years, the examiner primus of the Combine's admissions division was Varek Dan. I want to be precise about this, because precision is, nominally, the Combine's defining virtue. Varek Dan is not an unintelligent being. He is, by the Combine's own internal rankings, a calibrator of the first order. His doctoral survey work on the Orath shelf remains the foundational reference for tidal stress analysis in pressurized deep-water installations. His name is in the literature more times than I have counted. He is also, and I say this having worked under him for 19 years, a being who regards the Varek Meridian species as the correct kind of mind for precise technical work, and all other species as approximators who cannot be trusted with the instruments. He has never stated this formally. He does not need to. He states it through the examination. The pre-entry assessment, in its official description, is a 4-dimensional calibration problem. Candidates are given a physical measurement space, an actual chamber, not a simulation, and asked to produce the complete dimensional survey for that space to within a specified tolerance margin. The official tolerance is 1 in 10,000. The official average completion time listed in the Combine's published literature is 3 days. The actual average completion time for Varek Meridian candidates, in my 19 years of observation, is 18 hours. The actual average completion time for non-Varek candidates, for whom Vale consistently selects what he calls the standard problem set, is either 5 days or they do not complete it. The non-completion figure across my tenure runs to 61%. I had seen 6 non-Varek candidates pass in 19 years. 3 were from species whose sensory architecture is closely aligned with our own. The Varek Meridian cast has photophoric sensory organs and a perceptual field that extends into ranges most species do not naturally access. Candidates from species with similar sensory structures can sometimes compensate for the cultural training gap. 2 had taken the examination 3 times each before passing, the second attempt providing what the first had not, which was familiarity with the room's particular qualities. 1 had passed on her first attempt and had subsequently been quietly assigned to the lowest tier certification track. where she remained, and where no one was required to think carefully about what her score implied. I had never supervised a human candidate. I had, in the way of someone who has spent 19 years in one institution, stopped expecting to. The human's application file arrived on my desk on the 14th day of the third administrative cycle. Her name was Davy Sauce. She was 26 years old, a native of Errath-7, which I looked up, because I did not know the designation, and which turned out to be a Class 20 designation on the older Arden-Vass scale, or a Class 18 on the revised Kethavar standard. The classification discrepancy exists because errath-7 surface conditions fall into a border category that the two major rating bodies have argued about for 60 years. The central point of contention being whether the gravitational differential at the planet's equatorial ridge constitutes a permanent survivable hazard or a periodic one. The most recent joint report concluded that the dispute was unresolvable with current methodology and recommended tabling the question for a further review in 40 years. The humans on errath-7 have not waited for the report. They live on the equatorial ridge. Her previous employment record listed 9 years as a structural load assessor for transit infrastructure on 3 different stations and 2 planetary surfaces. Her credentials included 17 completed surveys, all at or above Class 5 complexity, certified by 3 different regional bodies. None of those regional bodies was the Varek Combine. That was the formal basis for her application. She had the experience record. She did not have the Combine seal, and she wanted the seal because the contracts she was qualified for without it had a ceiling she had reached and could see no way past. Her file also contained a personal statement. I read it twice, not because it was unclear, but because I had spent 19 years reading personal statements that ran to 3 and 4 pages of careful credential amplification and self-presentation, and hers was 4 sentences. The first 3 were a clear and concise account of her experience and her rationale for applying. The 4th sentence was, "I have been told the examination is difficult. I am prepared to work." I forwarded the file to Varek and waited. He returned it the same day with a 2-line note authorizing her entry into the pre-entry assessment and directing me to assign her to calibration suite 7. He also, in a postscript, noted that the standard problem set would apply and that the tolerance margin would be set at the full 1 in 10,000. The postscript had the quality of something written with particular care, not the care of someone making a decision, but the care of someone recording a decision that had already been made before the file arrived. I want to note for the record that the full 1 in 10,000 tolerance is not the only legal tolerance available. The Combine's own charter lists 3 tolerance grades. The full grade is the most demanding. The intermediate grade is half that precision requirement. The standard grade, used for entry-level certification work, is 1 in 2,000. Varek applied the full grade to every non-Varek candidate. He applied the intermediate grade to Varek Meridian candidates as a matter of standard practice. I had once asked him about this. He told me the full grade was the correct grade for ensuring quality in the guild. I had not asked again, because I understood that asking again would produce a longer version of the same answer and no actual change, and because I had 19 years of institution behind me, and institutions make you careful about which questions you ask twice. Calibration Suite 7 is a room I know well. I have supervised assessments in it for the entirety of my career, first as a junior witnessing examiner, then as a senior, with the full documentation responsibility and the sole authority to certify a witnessing record. It is not a large room, 43 meters on the longest axis, roughly elliptical, with a ceiling that curves upward to a central apex 14 meters above the floor at its highest point. The walls are not flat. They are articulated, a series of interlocking panels set at varying angles, some of which shift position on a 12-hour mechanical cycle, creating a survey space whose dimensional profile changes slowly over the course of a standard assessment. The candidate is expected to track these changes and account for them in the final submission. That is part of the problem. It is not the hardest part. The room also contains 7 load-bearing structures of varying type. 2 arch spans whose bases sit in the floor and whose crowns meet the ceiling. 3 vertical columns of differing cross-section. A suspended horizontal brace running diagonally across the upper third of the room's interior. And one element that the Combine's documentation lists simply as the composite node. A junction structure in the northwest quadrant where 3 of the other load-bearing elements converge in a configuration whose load distribution analysis is the examination's central challenge. The composite node is not physically impressive. It is not particularly large. It does not look, at first glance, like the kind of thing that has produced more failed assessments than every other element in the room combined. It looks like a structural junction. Candidates often underestimate it until they are in the middle of their second day of trying to characterize it precisely. The correct characterization of the composite node to full 1 in 10,000 tolerance has, in the recorded history of the Combine, been achieved by fewer than 400 candidates. Vale Orvakdan solved it famously in his own certification examination as a young man in 11 hours of continuous work, and the record has stood since. He has a model of the composite node on the wall of his office, built to the specifications he derived in that 11-hour session. It is a point of pride. I have seen it every morning for 19 years. My job, during a pre-entry assessment, is to sit at the examiner's station at the room's south end, record the candidate's working method and progress, and produce a witnessing report at the conclusion. I am not permitted to speak to the candidate except to clarify procedural questions or emergency safety matters. I am not permitted to indicate whether the candidate is progressing correctly, incorrectly, or at a rate consistent or inconsistent with other candidates. I am not permitted to intervene, advise, or react in a manner that could be interpreted as feedback. I am permitted to take notes. I am required to take notes. I take thorough notes. I have always found the silence easy. I am, by training and by inclination, an observer. With Davy Sauce, the silence became increasingly difficult, and for a reason I had not anticipated. It was not difficult because I wanted to help her. It was difficult because I wanted to ask her questions. She arrived on the morning of the first assessment day in standard field clothes, dark work trousers, a long-sleeved technical shirt, a vest with several tool pockets, each of which was filled in a way that suggested the pockets had a designated occupant, and that occupant was always in the same pocket. She was carrying a soft case of instruments. She was smaller than I expected. Varek Meridian adults average around 2 meters in standing height. She was perhaps a third shorter, compact in a way that I have since come to think of as the compactness of something that has been under sustained load for a long time and has organized itself around that fact. Her hair was cut short and was slightly untidy, not in the way of someone who does not care about appearance, but in the way of someone whose mornings involve other priorities than hair. She had a faint scar along her left forearm that looked like the kind of thing you accumulate on a Class 20 equatorial ridge, rather than the kind of thing you acquire by accident. Her hands, when she set the case on the table, had the particular quality of hands that have spent years on instruments in conditions where instruments fail, and you use your hands instead. She did not look at me when she entered. She looked at the room. She stood in the doorway for approximately 40 seconds, looking at the room. I had supervised many candidates entering calibration Suite 7 for the first time. Most of them looked at the instruments they had brought with them, at the examiner's station, or at the documentation packet I was required to hand them at the start of the session. The packet contains a formal introduction to the assessment, the tolerance specifications, the completion requirements, and a diagrammatic overview of the room. One candidate, years ago, had looked at the composite node immediately upon entering, and then looked away again very quickly, the way you look at something that is going to cost you before you are ready to deal with it. Davy Sauce looked at the room the way you look at something you are taking measurements of before you have your instruments out. She was not reading the documents. She was reading the walls. Then she came in, set her case down on the candidate's table, accepted the documentation packet, and read it in what I estimated to be 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which included, I noted, a brief pause at the structural diagram on page 4, where she held the page at a slight angle for approximately 8 seconds before continuing. Then she set the packet down and said, "Is there a preference for notation format, or can I use my own system?" I told her the Combine accepted any notation format that produced a complete dimensional record in a form that could be independently verified by a certified examiner. She said, "Good," opened her instrument case and began. The standard opening procedure for a calibration Suite 7 assessment, as described in every training guide the Combine has ever published, is systematic lateral measurement. Candidates establish a baseline along the room's longest axis, fix their coordinate reference points, and work outward from there, building the survey from the perimeter inward. It is the approach the literature describes. It is the approach that produces, when executed correctly, a solid foundation that can accommodate the wall panel shifts when they occur, and a documentation structure that certified examiners can follow and verify with minimal additional effort. The approach has two problems that are known, noted in the literature, and accepted as occupational conditions of the assessment. First, it requires you to reestablish your baseline after each panel shift, because the shift moves your reference wall, and the coordinate system you built against it becomes partially invalid. Candidates who work quickly can limit the disruption. Candidates who work slowly can find themselves rebuilding their baseline 3 times before they reach the composite node. Second, it means you encounter the composite node late, when you are tired and have already committed to a notation structure that may or may not accommodate what the node requires of it. And the node is the part that requires the most from your notation structure. Davy Sauce did not begin at a wall. She placed 3 reference instruments, small, compact, of a type I was not immediately familiar with. I noted their form factor in my record and looked them up after the session, at positions I would have selected as secondary reference points in a conventional survey. Not at the extremes of the room, not at the walls or the obvious anchor points, but at 3 locations that formed a triangle whose center, I realized as she placed the third one, was approximately aligned with the composite node. She placed the first instrument, checked something in its readout, placed the second, cross-referenced the 2, placed the third, made a mark in her notation book, and stood up. She did not look pleased or displeased with this. She looked like someone who had confirmed that something was where they expected it to be. Then she stood in the center of the room, turned slowly through 360 degrees with her notebook open, made a series of marks, and sat down at the candidate's table. She worked for the next 4 hours without a break, I observed, standing, sitting, sometimes crouching to take readings at floor level, sometimes stretching to reach reference points higher on the wall panels. She worked with the physical efficiency of someone who has done a great deal of work in awkward positions in conditions where being awkward costs time, and time is something you do not have. She did not stop. She did not look frustrated. She did not look particularly engaged, in the way that some candidates look visibly engaged when they are working well, alive to the problem, energized by progress. She looked like someone doing their work in the ordinary way that work gets done. At the 4-hour mark, I expected to see a developing baseline framework, the kind of preliminary dimensional sketch that tells you the candidate has a clear picture of the room's overall geometry and is now beginning to refine its measurement. The notation structure I saw instead was one I did not initially recognize. She was not building a map from the outside in. She was building a ratio. I understood this slowly. I want to be honest about that, because I am writing this deposition in part as a record of my own failure to immediately see what I was observing, and the honest record matters. It took me approximately 90 minutes to understand what she was doing, and I am a senior calibration examiner with 19 years of experience in calibration Suite 7 who has spent those years watching candidates work in that room and thinking hard about how they work. What I eventually understood was this. She was using the 3 reference instruments to establish a proportional relationship between the room's major load-bearing elements. Not a distance relationship, not an absolute coordinate framework. A proportional relationship, the ratio of one structural dimension to another, expressed as a number that remains constant regardless of where you stand or where the reference wall panel happens to be positioned when you take the measurement. The ratio does not change when the walls shift. The ratio is stable. If you work in ratios, you do not need to rebuild your baseline after a panel shift because your baseline is not the wall. Your baseline is the relationship between things that do not change. I had a thought at approximately the 6-hour mark that I noted down in my personal observer record and returned to that evening in my room. The thought was, in 19 years of calibration training and 19 years of witnessing assessments, no one has ever taught this approach. It is not in the literature. It is not in the training guide. It is not in the supplementary materials, the advanced methodology notes, or the doctoral level theoretical work I have read. We teach candidates to measure from a fixed point. We have always taught candidates to measure from a fixed point. She was measuring from a relationship, and the relationship was everywhere in the room at once, and it was not moving. At 6 hours, she took a 15-minute break. She drank water from a canteen she produced from her case. She ate something from her vest pocket without looking at it, a compact nutrition block of some kind, the kind of thing you eat when eating is a maintenance task rather than a meal. She sat at the candidate's table and looked at the ceiling for approximately 8 minutes. I could not determine what she was looking at specifically. She was not looking at her notes. She might have been doing calculations in her head, or she might have been resting, or both. I cannot tell from observation alone, and I did not ask. Then she stood up, went back to the instruments, and returned to work. At 8 hours, she was working on the composite node. I want to describe what it typically looks like when a candidate arrives at the composite node, so that the contrast is clear for whoever reads this record. A candidate working on the composite node typically spends a great deal of time at the physical structure itself, standing in front of it, measuring individual connection points, recording the measurements, cross-referencing them against the room's other load-bearing structures to find the common framework, and then recalculating when the cross-reference produces inconsistencies that are too small to be measurement error and too large to be acceptable. The composite node distributes its load across 6 connection points in a pattern that is not symmetrical. The distribution looks, on first measurement, like an approximation, like whoever built the room was rounding their figures and produced a structure that is correct to 3 or 4 significant figures and imprecise thereafter. Candidates who come in looking for clean symmetry spend days looking for symmetry that is not there. Candidates who accept the apparent irregularity and try to document it precisely spend days measuring small differences between the 6 connection points that are consistent enough to be patterned, but not consistent enough to be easily named. The fastest complete characterization of the composite node I had personally witnessed, in 19 years, was 14 hours by a Varek senior candidate who had the advantage of already knowing, from her training under Vale Orvakdan, what framework to expect the solution to fit into. Davy Sass stood in front of the composite node for approximately 8 minutes. She was not measuring. She was not moving. Her instruments were in her hands, but she was not using them. She was looking at the composite node the way she had looked at the room when she first entered, with that quality of attention I had initially described to myself as visual inspection, and had been slowly revising my description of for the entire preceding 8 hours, because it was not visual inspection in any sense I had a standard term for. She was not looking at the surfaces of the structure. She was looking at something else, the relationship between the surfaces, perhaps, the way that the apparent irregularity in the 6 connection points mapped onto the proportional framework she had been building all morning. I do not know. I was not in her head. I was at the examiner's station and I was watching her look at the composite node and I was writing in my notes, candidate at composite node, no measurement activity, sustained attention, 8 minutes. Then she made one notation in her book, a single entry. She did not remeasure. She did not cross-reference. She did not stand there longer. She made the notation, picked up her instruments, walked back to the candidate's table and sat down. I looked at the time, 8 hours and 7 minutes. I looked at my notes. I looked at the room. The composite node sat in its northwest quadrant, unchanged, exactly as it had always been. She worked at the table for another hour and 33 minutes, writing steadily. At 9 hours and 40 minutes, she set down her notation book, capped her pen and said, "I'm finished." I looked at the clock. I looked at her. I said, because the procedural forms required me to confirm, "You are submitting your completed assessment for formal review." She said yes. I said because I was required to. The standard review period is 48 hours. You will be notified of the outcome at the assigned contact address. She said thank you, picked up her instrument case and left. I sat at the examiner's station for some time after she left. This is not unusual. I often sit for a while after a session, organizing my notes, reviewing what I observed. What was unusual was that I sat for nearly 2 hours, and for most of those 2 hours I was reading her submission. Candidate submissions are provided to me as part of my witnessing responsibility. I am required to review them for completeness and to attach my witnessing report confirming that the submission was produced in the examination conditions I observed. I am not required to evaluate the submission's technical content. That is the reviewing examiner's role. I was, however, reading the technical content because I could not stop reading it. In 19 years, I had never seen a candidate complete a pre-entry assessment in under 14 hours. The record, in my time at the Combine, was 16 hours and 8 minutes. Before Davy Sauce, the fastest non-Varek completion I had personally recorded was 31 hours spread across 3 days, by a candidate who had taken the examination twice before, and had clearly used the first 2 attempts to map the room's baseline behavior. She had finished in 9 hours and 40 minutes. Her submission ran to 47 pages. This is not a short submission. The average passing submission runs to around 60 pages because the documentation requirements are extensive and the standard notation methods produce verbose records. 47 pages for a 9-hour, 40-minute session is not a short submission. It is a dense one. She had written more per hour than any candidate I had recorded. The composite node section was 4 lines. I read the 4 lines. I read them again. I turned to the room's other load-bearing structure sections, read those, turned back to the 4 lines. I got up and walked to the composite node in the northwest quadrant and stood in front of it for approximately the same length of time she had, 8 minutes or so, and then I went back to the table and read the 4 lines again. I will not reproduce them here because the notation requires the Kethavar Regional Convention Guide to parse, and this deposition is already long enough. I will say what I understood when I had read them 3 times. She had characterized the composite node's load distribution in 4 lines because 4 lines was the exact right length for that characterization. Not because she had been brief or lazy or incomplete. Because the load distribution described correctly is not a complicated thing. It is a ratio expressed 6 ways across 6 connection points, and if you have the ratio, you can state it once and note its 6 manifestations, and you are finished. The composite node is not complicated. The composite node has an exact form that the Combine has never found, and therefore the Combine has been describing it in 87 pages of approximation methodology for 312 years, and the 87 pages are impressive and careful and technically rigorous, and they are all getting very close to a thing that can be written in 4 lines. I sat at the table in calibration suite 7 with her 47-page submission, and I thought about a great many things. Eventually, I filed the submission and my witnessing report, noted the completion time, and went back to my quarters. I did not sleep well. The review came back in 11 hours. Vale Orvakdan typically took 48 hours with non-Varek submissions. I had long since understood that the 48 hours was not review time, but rather the administrative interval that made a rejection look like deliberation, rather than predetermination. 11 hours was not a deliberation interval. 11 hours was either a genuine fast review or a rejection that had been drafted before he finished reading the first page. The review document listed 3 grounds for invalidation. The first was notational. She had used a symbolic convention for expressing proportional relationships that was not in the Combine's standard notation guide. This was technically accurate. She had used a notation I recognized as a regional convention from the Kethavar Outer Survey Networks, common in that sector's infrastructure assessment community, not the Varek standard. The Combine's charter states, in Section 9, Paragraph 3, that submissions may use any notation system that produces a complete dimensional record in a form that can be independently verified by a certified examiner. The review document did not cite Section 9. It cited a supplementary procedural memo from 40 years prior, authored by Vale Orvakdan, which defined complete as including adherence to standard notation. The memo had never been formally ratified by the full Guild Council. It had been filed in the administrative record and referenced in subsequent rejection decisions, as though it had the force of a charter provision. In 40 years, no candidate had challenged this, either because they did not know the charter well enough to recognize the difference between a ratified provision and an unratified memo, or because challenging it carried professional costs they were not willing to pay. The second ground was temporal. She had completed the assessment in less than 12 hours. The review document cited an observation note, not a charter provision, stating that assessments completed in under 12 hours should be considered suspect for comprehensiveness and subject to additional scrutiny. The observation note had been filed by Vale Orvakdan 11 years prior, following the rejection of a non-Varek candidate whose fast completion time he had characterized in that note as implausible. There was no charter basis for the note. It was an opinion, formally filed in a way that gave it the appearance of a policy. The third ground was substantive. The composite node characterization was described as insufficient. The 4 lines were characterized as an incomplete description of a structure of significant complexity. The review document did not provide a specific technical objection to the 4 lines. It did not identify a measurement error, a missing element, or a logical gap. It stated that a structure of this complexity requires documentation commensurate with that complexity, which is an aesthetic preference about the appropriate length of documentation and not a calibration standard, and which is, if you think about it for a moment, precisely backwards. The correct documentation for a thing is the documentation that accurately describes the thing. And if the accurate description is 4 lines, then 4 lines is the correct documentation regardless of how complex the thing appeared before someone found the 4-line description. I read the rejection 3 times. Then I sent a formal message to Vale Orvakdan requesting written clarification on the specific charter provisions underlying each of the 3 grounds, on the basis that my witnessing report needed to reference those provisions precisely, and I wished to ensure accuracy. He replied that the charter basis was well established, and I should not require clarification if I had familiarized myself adequately with the relevant documentation. I sent the human a notification of the rejection with the grounds listed, as required. I also, in the same message, informed her that under Section 17b of the Charter, a candidate who believes the rejection was improperly grounded may request a re-examination under a different problem set. I included the relevant charter language. I did this because it is in the charter and she had the right to know it was there, and because Vale Orvakdan does not, in my observation, routinely include this information in rejection notifications. She replied within the hour. She said she would like to proceed with the re-examination. I reported this to Varek. He authorized the re-examination and directed me to assign her to calibration suite 7 again. He also attached a new problem set designation. Suite 7, Variant C. He did not explain the designation. Variant C is not a publicly listed problem set. It is referenced in one internal document that I had access to as a senior examiner, which describes it as the extended complexity version of the standard assessment used for candidates requiring additional verification of competence. In practice, this means 3 specific changes. The wall panel shift cycle is accelerated from 12 hours to 6, doubling the frequency at which a candidate must account for baseline drift. 3 additional measurement obstacles are introduced: low-hanging brace structures suspended from the ceiling at heights that interrupt the direct line of sight between the primary reference points used in any standard survey approach, forcing repeated repositioning. And the composite node is locked in configuration 4, which is the most load-active orientation, and the one in which the apparent irregularity of the connection point distribution is at its greatest, the one in which the approximation method produces its worst results, and the most work is required to produce even an approximate characterization. There is no published record of any candidate passing Variant C. There are no published records of Variant C at all, because Varek has never included it in the Combine's public examination documentation. Its existence was known to senior examiners and presumably to Varek private administrative files. It was not known to candidates. I spent one evening after receiving the authorization reading the charter on the subject of candidate notification requirements. Section 14, paragraph 1, states that candidates must be informed of all material conditions affecting the examination they are undertaking before that examination commences. The question of whether an undisclosed change in examination difficulty constitutes a material condition seems to me to have an obvious answer. I sent Davy Sauce a message describing the specific parameters of the re-examination, the 6-hour wall cycle, the presence of 3 sightline obstruction structures, the composite node in configuration 4. I provided the configuration chart from the internal documentation. I described what each difference meant in practical terms. I did not tell her the examination was harder than the standard. I told her exactly what would be in the room. Varek did not know I had sent the message. That was, I recognized at the time, a considered choice on my part, and I noted it as such in my personal record. She arrived for the re-examination 8 days after the rejection notification. She arrived at the same time of morning, in the same clothes, carrying the same case. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room again. This time it took approximately 60 seconds. The 3 brace obstacles were visible immediately. They hang at a height that would force any standard approach candidate to work around them repeatedly throughout the session. She looked at them with the same flat attention she had given the room the first time, cataloging what was there and what it meant for what she was about to do. She came in. She accepted the documentation packet. She read it in 3 minutes and 8 seconds. She paused at the structural diagram again, this time for longer, approximately 14 seconds, because configuration 4 has a different diagram than the standard, and she was comparing it against what I presumed was the configuration chart I had sent her. She said, "The node is in configuration 4. The previous orientation was configuration 2. I confirmed this was correct, and that it was documented in the packet. She said, "Is the configuration chart I was sent the same as the one in the packet, or is there a more detailed version available?" I checked the packet. The chart in the packet was the standard overview. I had sent her the standard overview. I told her there was a more detailed technical diagram in the extended documentation archive, and that she was entitled to request it under Section 14. She requested it. I pulled it from the archive file and handed it to her. She looked at it for approximately 2 minutes. She made a mark in her notebook. She said, "Thank you," and set it down. She placed her reference instruments. For this time, not 3. The 4th went to a position that took me a moment to understand. It was compensating for the sightline obstruction created by one of the 3 brace structures, placed at the exact angle that would preserve the proportional relationship she had used in the first assessment despite the brace being in the way. She had looked at the brace obstacle, looked at where her 3rd instrument would ordinarily go, understood the geometry, and placed the compensating 4th instrument. It took her approximately 40 seconds to decide where the 4th instrument should be. I noted the time. She worked for 7 hours. I will not describe the 7 hours in the same detail as the first session, because the structure was similar enough that the description would be repetitive. The differences were these. She moved more because the braces required more repositioning. She paused at the panel shifts, of which there was one during the session, for approximately 12 minutes to update her ratio framework, and her work on the composite node, which she reached at the 6-hour mark, was longer. She stood in front of it for not 8 minutes but 22, and made 3 notations rather than 1. Configuration 4 is genuinely harder. The additional 14 minutes and 2 notations are not a failure. They are an accurate reflection of added complexity. At 7 hours, she stood up, capped her pen, and said, "I'm finished." I processed the submission forms. She left. I read her submission while I was still in the room. 51 pages this time, longer than the first, commensurate with the increased complexity. The composite node section was 8 lines. 4 for the ratio itself, and 4 for the configuration for specific load modifications, each line precise, each one derivable from the one before it if you understand where she is starting from. She had also, in the section covering the 3 brace obstacles, included a brief footnote. The footnote noted that the 3 structures were contributing to the room's overall stress distribution in a way that the examination documentation had not addressed, and that their contribution, while small, was non-zero and should be included in any complete survey of the space. She had calculated their contribution. She had included it. She had solved for elements that the examination had not asked her to solve for, because they were part of the room, and leaving them out would mean the survey was incomplete, and the survey was for a room, and the room includes the braces. I sat with that footnote for a long time. Then I filed the submission and wrote my witnessing report. I also wrote 2 other documents that evening. The first was a formal memorandum under Charter Section 22D, covering procedural concerns in examination administration, citing the 3 grounds from the first rejection in detail: the unratified supplementary memo, the 12-hour opinion note, and the unauthorized deployment of a non-public problem set without candidate notification. I had been composing variations of this memorandum, in my head if not on paper, for a significant portion of 19 years. I sent it that night. The second document was a technical annex to the memorandum. I had spent 14 hours working through her proportional notation using the Kethavar Regional Survey Convention Guide, verifying that I was reading her characterization correctly and that the characterization was mathematically sound. When I had finished, I sat very still for a while, because what I had verified was that the 4 lines and the 8 lines were correct, and that the Varek Academic Combine's 87 pages of composite node approximation methodology had been converging, for 312 years, on the number that her 4 lines produce exactly. Every significant figure in the Combine's literature is a less precise version of the exact value. Every discrepancy that calibrators have treated as measurement noise or instrument limitation is rounding error. The number exists. It is exact. It is 4 lines long. We had not known it. I attached this analysis to the memorandum. I sent both documents to Vail Orvakdan, and under Section 22D's parallel reporting requirement, to the Combine's Administrative Oversight Office. Then I went to bed. I slept poorly again. The review of the second submission was returned in 47 hours. It listed 2 grounds for invalidation. The notation ground appeared again. The unratified supplementary memo was cited again. The second ground was new. The composite node characterization was described as non-standard in methodology and not aligned with established Combine analysis frameworks, with a specific note that the proportional approach and the resulting for-and dateline documentation was an unrecognized methodology of unverified validity. The brace obstacle footnote was not addressed. I noted this in my response. I sent a second memorandum. This one was longer. It noted that unrecognized and invalid are distinct concepts, that the difference is answerable by checking the mathematics, that I had checked the mathematics and attached the verification, and that the review document had not identified any mathematical error in the submission. It noted that a methodology which produces a result more precise than the established framework and consistent with all physical measurements is not invalid because it is not the established framework. It is the established framework's successor, and the established framework's role, if it has any claim to the scientific tradition it represents, is to recognize that. I also included, in that memorandum, a formal request for a ruling on whether the supplementary notation memo had ever been ratified by the full Guild Council, citing the specific ratification record I had found, which showed it had not, and asking the Oversight Office to confirm the finding. Varek Academic's response arrived the following morning. It was addressed to me personally. It said that my memoranda had been received and would be reviewed in due course, that I should proceed with formal notification of the second rejection, and that repeated filing of procedural memoranda outside the standard review cycle was itself an irregularity that would be noted in my personnel record. I read this once. Then I filed a formal dispute citation with the Measurement Arbitration Board under Sections 7, 17b, and 22d. I attached everything. The 2 memoranda, the technical analysis, both examination submissions, my complete witnessing reports, the charter provisions, the unratified supplementary memo, the 12-hour opinion note, the variant C internal documentation, and a written account of what I had personally observed in calibration Suite 7 during both assessment sessions. Then I sent Davy Sauce a message informing her that the second result was under formal dispute before the arbitration board, and that I could not predict a timeline, but she would be notified of the outcome. I told her she had done the work correctly. She replied, "Thank you for telling me." 4 words. I have thought about those 4 words for 4 months. The Measurement Arbitration Board convened 18 days later. The session lasted 6 hours. I will summarize. In the first hour, the board reviewed the submissions and witnessing reports. The 3 technical members of the 7 active calibration theorists, senior academics outside the administrative structure, reviewed the composite node characterizations. One of them, a board member I had met once before at a guild symposium, asked me at length about the proportional notation. I explained it as best I could, which was adequately but not expertly, because it is not my primary training. He then read the Kethavar Convention Guide section I had attached, read the 4-line characterization, and sat quietly for approximately 4 minutes. Then he said to the room, not to anyone in particular, "This is closed form." The second board member asked what he meant. He said, "This is the exact value." Not an approximation, the exact. He paused. "We have been approximating this for 300 years. The board requested a formal verification recess. The session was suspended for 48 hours while the technical members worked through the mathematics independently. During the recess, Varek Academic's team submitted a counteranalysis. It was 22 pages. Its central argument was that the proportional approach, while producing a numerically consistent result, was not a valid calibration methodology because it had not been validated by the Combine and could not therefore be accepted as a certified method. This is a circular argument. It does not address whether the number is correct. It addresses whether the method has permission to be correct. I read it and made a note in my record. The argument is circular. I have included that note in this deposition because I believe it is the kind of note that should be in the record. The verification team's report was 3 pages. It confirmed that the proportional characterization was mathematically correct. It further noted that the exact value reproduced the composite node's measured load distribution to 14 significant figures, compared to the Combine's approximation method, which reproduces it to 9. The 5-figure difference had been present in the physical measurements for 300 years and had been treated, consistently, as measurement noise. The board reconvened. In the second part of the session, the supplementary notation memo's ratification history was examined in full. It had never been ratified. The charter language was read. The board found it had no binding force, and all rejections citing it were noted for review. The 12-hour opinion note was found to be exactly that, an opinion, not a rule. The variant C problem set was found to have been deployed without charter authorization for candidate notification. The board found that the candidate had been informed of the examination conditions. My message to her was in the record, and that the examination had therefore been conducted fairly at the candidate level, though the administrative deployment remained an irregularity. Then the board considered the substantive question: was the second submission a passing result? The technical members conferred for approximately 10 minutes. Then the board chair said, "The submission demonstrates mastery of the survey problem to a tolerance exceeding the stated examination standard. The submission includes analysis of structural elements not required by the examination brief, performed correctly. The submission is a passing result." Varek Academic's authority to issue rejections without co-signature from a second examiner was suspended pending a full administrative review of rejection records under his administration for the prior 20 years. The supplementary notation memo was formally struck from the procedural record. The variant C problem set was entered into the public examination documentation, with the requirement that any future deployment include explicit advance notification to candidates of its enhanced parameters. Varek did not speak during the final part of the session. He sat at the table and did not speak. He is a man who occupies rooms with the settled assurance of someone who has never had occasion to doubt that the room is arranged around his comfort and his standards. I watched him sit quietly, and I thought about the model of the composite node on his office wall, built to the approximated value, built to the value that is correct to 9 significant figures and wrong at the 10th. It has been on that wall for over 40 years. He built it as a young man from his own examination work, from the 11 hours he spent in calibration suite 7 finding the best approximation the Combine's framework could produce. It is extraordinary work, genuinely. 9 significant figures is extraordinary work. The question is only whether extraordinary approximation, performed with great skill over a long career, is the same as the truth. It is not the same. It is very close. But the ratio is exact, and exact is different from very close, and the difference is the difference between what the Combine has been teaching and what she walked in knowing on her first morning. I want to be clear. I did not feel satisfied. I do not feel satisfied now. I feel that something has been corrected, which is not the same as satisfaction, because what has been corrected was a long time in being corrected, and several things broke before it was, and those things cannot be entirely repaired. After the board session, I found Davy Sauce in the corridor outside the chamber. She had waited, I do not know how long. I told her the finding. I told her she would receive her provisional Class 1 Guild seal within the standard 10-day processing period, and that the full certification examination was available at her convenience. She listened, she said, "Thank you." Then she asked me a question. She said, "The composite node, did anyone here know it had a closed form before I filed the submission?" I told her no. I told her the Combine's entire analytical literature had treated it as approximable but not exactly solvable. I told her I had spent 19 years in that room and had not known it either, and that I had read her 4 lines and spent the following 3 hours understanding what I was reading, and that I wanted her to know both of those things were true. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "On errath-7, the load structures all behave the same way. The ratio shows up in everything that holds. We call it the baseline. I thought every calibrator knew." She said this without emphasis, without pride, without any quality of announcement. She said it the way you say something that is simply true, that you assumed others knew, and that you are mildly, practically surprised to learn was not as widely shared as you believed. I stood in the corridor for a moment after she walked away. I was thinking about the equatorial ridge of a Class 20 Deathworld, where the gravitational differential creates a structural environment in which approximation is not a working methodology. It is a casualty mechanism. Where close enough is not close enough, because the difference between close enough and exact is the difference between a structure that holds under load and a structure that does not hold under load. And on errath-7, a structure that does not hold under load does not merely fail. It fails in an environment that does not offer second assessments. She had not been taught the ratio in a classroom. It had not been in her training literature. It had been in the ridge itself, in the structures built by people who could not afford to approximate, worked forward over years until it was simply what you know before you know anything else. The way you stand before you learn to walk, the datum you start from, because starting from anything less is not a survivable option. The Combine has a different relationship with its starting point. The Combine started from very good approximation, which is not the same starting point. And for 312 years, very good approximation has been sufficient for every application the Combine serves, because the applications it serves do not impose the penalty that errath-7's equatorial ridge imposes. Close enough has been close enough. The difference has been noise. She walked in from a place where the difference is not noise. She had been carrying the exact value her entire working life. She had assumed we had it too. I do not know what the Combine will do with the exact value. That determination belongs to the Technical Review Commission the board has convened. I expect the process will take several years, as the scope of the literature that relies on the approximated value is substantial. I expect that in most practical applications the change will be small. 9 significant figures is enough precision for the vast majority of installation work, and the structures built on the approximated value are, in general, fine. The ratio is not a correction to a dangerous error. It is a correction to an unnecessary imprecision, and the distinction matters. What I keep returning to is not the technical correction. It is the 4 months I have spent since that board session thinking about the moment she stood in the doorway of calibration suite 7 and looked at the room for 40 seconds. I have supervised that room for 19 years. I know every panel, every column, every arch. I know the composite node the way you know a problem you have worked around for so long that working around it feels like understanding it. I watched her stand in that doorway and look at the room, and I know now, in a way I did not know then, what she was looking at. She was reading the ratio. It was in the geometry of the door frame. It was in the relationship between the ceiling apex and the floor, in the proportional spacing of the wall panels, in the angles at which the 2 arch spans met the floor. It was everywhere in that room, because the room was built in it whether anyone intended that or not, because the ratio is what holds, and so the ratio is what you build with whether you name it or not. She could see it because she had always seen it. She had grown up seeing it. On errath-7's equatorial ridge, in the structures that stand and the ones that do not, the ratio is visible to anyone who has lived there long enough and paid attention. She walked in, looked at the room for 40 seconds, saw the ratio, and spent the rest of the morning confirming it. We had been in that room for 312 years. We had been confirming the approximation. I have nothing further to add to the technical record. The board's findings stand on their own. This personal deposition is filed because the record, without it, would reflect a procedural dispute resolved in the candidate's favor, and that is accurate but insufficient. What the record should also reflect is this. The Combine spent 83 years designing an examination to measure mastery, and when something walked in that had mastered the problem at a level the examination could not recognize, the examination failed. That failure was not only Vale or Vakdan's failure, though his conduct made it worse and longer. That failure was the Combine's, which is to say it was mine also. We built an examination to measure how well candidates approximate what we already know, and we called that measurement mastery, and we were mostly correct. Approximation done well is a form of mastery. It is a form of mastery that stops at 9 significant figures. The room knew the exact value. It was always in the room. She measured it correctly the first time. Submitted under Academic Conduct Protocol 44C. Selveth Orinkaz, Senior Calibration Examiner, 2nd Meridian Cohort. Varek Academic Combine.